combination, I think, of my voice and I believe the microphone set as loud as it can go. So how's the back row doing? Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, we'll try to really project as far as we can. So it's my honor to welcome you to the Vulnerability Hothouse. Just to start, though, we'd like to get a sense of who's in the room with us. So could you just give me your hand up if you're part of what you would consider primarily the anti-trafficking advocacy or policy community, if you work with a nonprofit in anti-trafficking specifically? Great, thank you. And if you're here from the computational science or AI side, could you raise your hand, please? Great, we have a very good mix. Thank you for joining us. My name's Davina Durgana. I'm the senior statistician and report co-author of the Global Slavery Index. I also direct our multiple systems estimation program in Europe and with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I'm also the director of our vulnerability work on the Global Slavery Index, which is done at a global level. So it's really interesting to me to be with my colleagues today talking about some of this work. The format of this panel will effectively run, we'll do a very brief introduction, myself. We have our wonderful rapporteur, Todd Landman from the Rights Lab. And we will also be giving each of our speakers about 10 minutes. This will be very quick. In order to make this as interactive as possible and to make sure that all of the speakers can get through their allocated material, what we'll actually be doing is having each presenter give their 10-minute presentation, and then we'll take 2 or 3 questions. We have our colleague Emily in the background with a roving mic, so just make sure you raise your hand and she'll come to you. We won't take more than that between the panels, and then we'll have a healthy amount of time for Q&A at the end just before lunch. Does anyone have any housekeeping questions before we get started? No. Okay, lovely. So we're going to start with my colleague Maria. Maria, please introduce yourself and take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. And I'm Maria Olave. I am part of the regional team of child labor in the ILO for regional office in Latin America and the Caribbean countries. And today, this is, Emily, do you have our presentation with this part?
Yeah. Use the clicker.
With this? Sorry. Okay. And today I would like to share with you our experience related to the child labor risk identification model. This presentation is part of interagency work between International Labor Organization and the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And in the first part, I would like to share with you the different stages related to our research work. In the first stage, we were interested in answering the question, how many children are working? Because in this time, we are interested in make visible this problem in order to promote specific policies, tackle it from government, NGOs, and different stakeholders. After that, our research was focused in the question, where are the child workers? Because we needed to find them and give them, their families and their communities, specific services and programs in order to recover their rights, specific in health, education, social protection, or income generation. Currently, since 2015, we are interested in answering the last question. Who is vulnerable to child labor? Because we want to identify the children and territories at risk of child labor with the objective to interrupting the trajectory of child labor and offering better prevention services. In this slide, I would like to share with you quickly the situation about child labor in our region. In the blue part, you can see that in Latin America, we have a descending tendency, but it's a good news. But related to the achieve of target 8.7, we have some problems. Because if we keep doing the same, probably we wouldn't to achieve this target by 2025. So our approach now in the region is to accelerate this process of reduction. And for that, in Latin America, we have a new strategy with 2 components. And in the second, for example, the first component is a political component. And in 2014, a group of countries of Latin American region created the regional initiative Latin American Free of Child Labor. Today, it's as 30 member countries and participation of employers and organization workers. This platform supports our research work and has the commitment to use the data in policy decisions about child labor and towards 8.7 target in their countries and specific productive sectors. The technical component, the second is the technical component, and this component has been designed between ECLAC and ILO, and this is the Child Labor Risk Identification Model. This is a tool with two main objectives. For the first, we want to identify the territories with more probability of child labor in order to focus our prevention efforts. Of the second, we want to estimate the weight of risk indicators and defines which multisectoral actions are more relevant in order to break the child labor trajectory. Currently, we are applying this model in both versions in 13 countries across the region, and we designed two versions of this model. One of the red color is based on statistical data, population census and child labor surveys, and that produce a likelihood that is child or adolescents will work. And the second version is the blue in the picture, and is based on administrative records and proxy variables, and to address the vulnerability on a specific territory to child labor. It's important to share with you that our approach has been work with data available in the countries, because in our countries in America and in Latin America, we have a lot of data, public data, and this in order to offer a tool, cost-efficient tool for the governments, because we need that they continue this work after our intervention. This process includes this model includes a training process in order to transfer to methodology to the specific governments or department of the government in different countries. And how we apply this model? This model is applied in 4 steps. First, identifying the most relevant child labor associated factors and risk and protection factors, both. And this is basically a revision of evidence available to child labor, and this step is common for both versions of the model. And step 2, we have 2 methods. For the vulnerability model, that is the beige part. And for this model, we will select variables that allow explain the child labor. And for the likelihood model, the green part, we will elaborate the logistic regression based on surveys of child labor surveys. And the step 3, for the vulnerability model, the beige part, every dimension, what education, social protection, of labor market, will be integrated with the variables in a sub-index in order to calculate the vulnerability. This part is similar to the index human development of the UNDP. And for the likelihood model, we insert the values of the coefficient resulting from the logistic regression in the step 2 as a new variables in the census available in the countries. And for the last step, 4th step, is common for both versions of the model and will let us identify the factors of variables most important to explain the child labor and how they are expressed in different territories. And finally, we can use other sources of complementary information available in the country in order to characterize the territories and complete the picture of the risk of child labor. And this is the part of the results we obtain after the application of the model. In the green map, you can see the information available, the usual information available even in our countries before the apply of the model. For example, in this case of Brazil, we have information about child labor distributed across 27 states. In the second map is the information available with the application of the risk model, more disaggregation at the municipal level. We have more detail about the risk of child labor. And the third map, you can see a specific state, in this case, a Rio de Janeiro state, and every municipality into this state with the probability of child labor in every municipality. And Brazil was our country for validate this model in 2015 because this usually measures child labor in its census. And now we have an estimator, the child labor risk in Brazil for 5,500 municipalities across the country. This is other example, for example, in Mexico and in Peru. These are after the application of the likelihood version. This is the probability, the likelihood version. The estimation in Mexico was for 2,300 municipalities, and in Peru was for 1,700 districts. Okay. And this is the example for Chile. This is the example for Chile and Costa Rica. In this case, we use the vulnerability model, the version of the model. And other kind of result, this is other kind of result. We can find hot and cold spots, territories with child labor, and this is useful for our governments make decision, for example, because some areas, some geographical areas has similar productive structure, and so a productive sector, and we can design a specific intervention. Or population, for example, in some geographical area of our countries, we have indigenous population, and it's a different approach to address child labor. And in this case, is the other expression of our result after the apply of the model. And for example, in this case, you can, with this information, you can classify every municipality in different risk levels according to the weight, every variable that you can identify during the process. And finally, this model is useful for four important things. For example, is using now for our governments to update the planification policies focused on child labor because they have new information for the local intervention. And it's cost efficient because we use data available in the countries. It's not necessary additional investment for obtaining new data. And let's focus public intervention in specific geographical areas and productive sectors. And accorded with variables related to the risk child labor, different actors need to work together. So this lets us improve our coordination between different sectors of the government, a public partnership, for example, in some areas. And this information that we will share. My time is done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you. So now, true to our interactive form, we have about 10 minutes to take questions on Maria's presentation. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask about? Please. Oh, sorry. I think we have a roving mic coming for you.
I'm Louise Shelley. I'm a professor at George Mason University. In your map of Mexico, if you were mapping organized crime in Mexico, you would have a very high correlation between where organized crime is pronounced and your red spots. So have you looked at these problems of how do you counter this and have community resistance to child labor where you have such powerful trafficking criminal organizations?
We will share this presentation with my colleague Andres Espejo. This is from our team in the CLAF Commission for Latin American, and this is the expert in the data and in variables. Andres, would you help me with this? At the moment, we don't recover information related with the crime version of the child labor. And because this data is not available, available in our countries. But in the parts nowadays, currently we are in the second phase of the model in Chiapas state, for example. And in this state, we have working in a new rapid assessment, local rapid assessment, in order to complement this information. And with the new data, we can measure migration flows or maybe criminal situation. But this is so difficult at the moment because the government doesn't have this information available. But the model can include this information. But we need that the data exists in the country.
Hello, everyone. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Basically, in the first step, we need to estimate the probability in the local area of the child labor. And the second phase, the idea is characterize this local area with other information. For example, migration, criminology, etc. And in this sense, it's possible to characterize and create and do new data for your purpose. And the other example is use the hotspot map to in trying to explain the probability of vulnerability of child labor. It's not only in one territory. Maybe it's on a part of the major region and across different countries at the time.
Thank you. And Dr. Shelley, do you have any follow-up questions or?
It's not a follow-up question, but I mean, there are Mexican researchers looking at where is the prevalence of organized crime and the trafficking routes. So there is already data. That's why I commented that there is such a correlation between where you're finding child labor and where Mexican researchers are finding these patterns of movement.
We can share our contacts. No, sorry. We can share our contacts, and maybe I can use your input in our model, and can produce a better document.
Excellent. A strong outcome already. Integration of new data into an existing model. That is wonderful. Does anyone else have another question maybe on this as well? Yes, please.
I have a question about the data set you used for modeling. Is this a government data set, and how how extensive is the data set? How many cases of child labor are in the data set you used for your modeling practice?
Depends of the model. In the survey, for example, there's a lot of countries in the Latin America that have a surveys of child labor. And these surveys, we can identify the variables, but these variables need to the same variables with the census to replicate the probability in the census. With the surveys, we estimate in the variable the weight of each variables, and then copy and paste this weight in the census and estimate the probability. On the other model, with a vulnerability index model, it's very similar. Identify proxy variables in the literature, and then with the administrative record, for example, education of child education, or education for adults, or I don't know, labor indicator, formability, etc.
How about in Brazil? Is also survey-based, the data set?
In Brazil, there's have a surveys, the PNAD. It's a household survey, and use the census. In Mexico, have a survey on census. And the other countries, for example, in Costa Rica, there's the survey is a new survey, but the census is very old. And in this case, use the administrative records.
Do you have concerns about the accuracy, the quality of the
Yeah,
data
of course,
from
yeah.
the survey? Because what's the incentive for me to report my science child labor, for example?
Yeah, of course.
And sorry, just can everyone hear the conversation in the back? Probably not. No, so just to recap, there were some questions about the extensiveness of the data. So how much information was there? What was the quality of that data? And it looks like there's actually some it's limited by the surveys and the information that can be used to gather those tools. But it looks like actually there's deep penetration of some useful surveys. It sounds like in Costa Rica, Mexico, I think you mentioned Brazil as well.
Brazil, Peru, Colombia.
And I think this is something we encounter a lot in the vulnerability modeling world, right? We're being opportunistic about the data we have and trying to then fill gaps as we identify them.
Yes. Yeah. In some countries, for example, in Peru, in Colombia, and in Guatemala now, probably, we will use the data of social protection programs, because this data is kind of census of the poor population, of the vulnerability population. So we use this data for apply this model when the census is all or the other information is not available for us.
Only for conclusion, the idea is use the data available in the countries, but a new way. This is important. In the countries, many labor ministry have data, but don't use for this purpose. The idea is use your data for this way, and this is very useful.
And make decisions with this data.
Yes, it looks like we have a question in the back. I'm sorry. And then this is our last question for this section, then we'll get another 10 minutes after the next speaker.
Hi there. Can everyone hear me? My name's Chloe Sett. I work at Lumos Foundation. I wanted to ask a question about the census data. One of the areas, so as you heard earlier from my colleague Chris, one of the areas we work on is children living in institutional care, like orphanages and so on. And often those children are left, they're kept separate from general data, like household survey data, which only collects survey about children living in a household rather than those living outside of a household, such as in institutions or in orphanages or street children. I wondered if you came across that in your work looking at the population data, and how you tried to capture those children as well. Thank you.
No, sorry. No, the census only capture the household information, and the surveys too. And for this reason, don't measure this problem.
I guess it's good that we're going to talk about that as a hidden population later, because obviously by being a hidden population is they're more vulnerable to exploitation in some ways and not being captured. And that's something we're looking to help influence with the Sustainable Development Goals, the principle of leave no child behind, making sure every child is counted. Great, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chloe. And actually, I was going to note, this is a problem I think that many of us face. So even with the Global Slavery Index and the global estimates of modern slavery, those surveys administered by Gallup will also miss institutionalized populations. And that's not just children in orphanages, but also prisoner populations, like lots of groups. So the more that we can collaborate, especially with our colleagues from AI and computational science, to think a little bit about how we can create surveys that can fit into some of the nationally representative projects we are already working on to try to understand where those populations can be better counted, we'd really appreciate that. So with no further ado, we're going to go to our colleague, James.
Okay, hi. Actually, I'm just going to start my. How long have I got? 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay.
I'll give you a warning at a minute, and then I'll let you know.
You don't need to write it down politely. You can just nudge me. It'll be absolutely fine. You start. So yeah, I'm going to talk about vulnerability mapping, which I obviously mentioned earlier, and this could be called the adventures of a computer scientist into an area they don't really know enough about, because I'm part of the Rights Lab, which is a collaboration of a huge amount of people from different fields. My field originally econometrics and economics, and moved to computer science and machine learning. So this is what I'm going to talk about is a combined effort from a huge sort of group of people, both technical people, but also people like Kevin Bales and Todd and Zoe Trod, who have expertise and experience in this area that we kind of leveraged in many ways. So I'm going to be talking about how we've tried to start using machine learning and big data. So I'm going to use the word big data. I'm not that comfortable with either the words AI or say machine learning instead of AI. I'm still not at the point where I think it's intelligent yet. And also big data, when I really mean mass novel data streams that we've been looking at in Tanzania, which is a country with a lot of problems in East Africa, where we've worked a lot before. And also, it's suffering a huge amount of rapid urbanization, which is a feature of the whole area, really. Like, people are flooding into cities and they're becoming mega slums, as Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Moshi, all have very similar experiences. And it's also similar to areas in South America as well. So Barranquilla we looked at in Colombia, and similar circumstances. And they have a lot of problems, mass informal settlements with no infrastructure, no sanitation, so huge problems. 70% of the cities are essentially slums, so obviously serious problems there. This is actually the route from the airport to the hotel I stay at. It takes about 2 hours to go a few miles, so huge infrastructural problems. And all these touch on different SDGs. They also have just covered the city in concrete, despite it having very severe rainy seasons. So flooding is actually a severe problem with people losing their houses on a regular basis. And that also generates, obviously, sanitation, health problems. The first time I was there was a huge cholera outbreak, which was related. And so huge amount of issues that touch on all sorts of SDGs. So the work we look at is holistic in a sense. I don't believe we should look at modern slavery by itself, and it's connected to all these other aspects. When we actually first got there wasn't really any maps of the place as well, and we worked with some people at the World Bank on the periphery. We can't claim effort for this. This is Tandali, one of the slums in Dar es Salaam, and it's teeming with life. It's hugely dense population. It's actually a central market here, but if you looked on Google Maps at the time, it's like there's nothing there. This is symptomatic of the lack of information in these areas. So there was a huge project called Ramani Huria, which used community support to go and map the city. So about 500 students, volunteers went and mapped the city. It's a big World Bank project, and they turned it from this to what it actually looks like underneath. So I use as an example, really, of we are sort of in a similar situation where we don't really have the underlying information that we need to do what we need to do. And while these maps are fantastic and all the geographers get really excited about them, for me, they're kind of empty because they don't tell me about the people in the places. So, you know, we can see the houses, but underneath there are all these people living in sometimes desperate conditions, living their lives, but, you know, there is some serious issues going on, and this comes from qualitative research that we know these things are coming in from rural areas and now existing more and more in the slums in the areas that we're looking at. And as I said earlier, the two key problems of it are, if you're doing machine learning and you're building models, you need some ground truths. So some examples that the machinery can learn from. And it's very hard for us to define those at the moment. So there's a big job at hand of trying to fill in these data sets. And when we do that, we're trying to also predict in areas, you know, incidents, just like we're trying to create vulnerability indices. But also when we do that, we're trying to then unpack the model to see what it tells us about the actual processes. And that generates hypotheses that then go on to the qualitative research again. And one of the things I mentioned this for, really, is that we've got all these issues in the city, so terrible issues, poverty, flooding, all touching on different SDGs. But they're different, and 8.7 is a different kettle of fish to these others because these are visible. When I walk around the city, I can see them really clearly. It's really easy to obtain data for them, so traffic counts and so on, whereas the issues we're looking at are hidden. They're obscured. The data we have is often unreliable. And it's multi-view. It comes from different sources. So this is a real issue and part of what I'll be talking about here. So I'll just skip that. Now, the reason I mentioned it, I don't know how many AI machine learning people there are in the room, but if you do, does anyone recognize that data set? Anyone brave enough? Yes, one person. So that's ImageNet. So ImageNet is a huge database of images that has been created and put online, connected to words. And there's about 14 million images in there, all labeled. And the AI community has taken that, and you can probably, I don't know if you can see from the Google citations, 10,000 scientific papers since it was created. And so people are using AI and creating new techniques they are coming to this data set because they just want to see if their algorithms work and if they can improve them. So they're coming here and they're applying all this stuff to this neat curated data set. And this is some of the greatest minds in the country are analyzing this and creating stuff, but they're doing it to find pictures of dogs. And can they recognize a park bench separate from a bit of grass behind it? And this seems like we're missing a trick. And the reason is that data is there for them. So I think we have kind of a responsibility to try and build those data sets so we can engage with that community, and hopefully we can do that as part of this event. So as I said, a call to arms on, all my circles have gone out of shape, of these different areas we can help with. So the first key thing, data capture. How can we build the ImageNet equivalent for this space? And that's tricky because it's hidden. So there's a lot of leveraging of data proxies, which we've heard about already. And so that's an area that, again, AI can help us with, as well as then leverage to do the analysis after. So we're kind of pushing in this sort of process a new notion of probabilistic data assembly. We've brought mathematicians together and computer scientists to try and say, okay, it's not just a ground truth anymore. We've got to build up a probabilistic picture of what we think the data is underneath. And there's fields like data augmentation and multiple systems estimation, which are trying to essentially conjure these figures from the best information you've got, but they're probabilistic in some sense. But if we can build that, then we can start applying models to it and unpacking the drivers. So what I'm going to show you is some precursory work. It's still in process in Dar es Salaam. And what we went to try and do is, to build a model, let's get some ground truths first. So there's some actual on-the-ground information about vulnerability by working with the local communities who are engaged in the mapping projects and actually ask them about the issues. But Dar es Salaam is huge. There's about 6 million people there now, probably 10 million in a few years. So a lot of people and about 450 subwards that all have different characteristics attached to them. So the process I'm just going to talk about now is our first engagement into trying to generate this information. So this is part of the first team that we created, which was, we called it the grid survey. And it's very difficult to use survey techniques in Western survey techniques in these sort of contexts, because there's a different understanding of percentages and statistics. Local knowledge means if you ask someone a question on a scale, how bad is this situation? It's always the top mark that you get. So you don't get really usable results, and it's not results that you can feed into a machine learning model. So we're trying to promote new ways of doing surveying using mathematical approaches, and this one was using a technique called I'm just going to skip through it. Comparative judgment. So instead of asking someone to score something, you ask them to compare the vulnerability to SDG 8.7 issues in one area compared to another. And they say at the start the areas that they know, so they're using local knowledge. And if you get enough people doing this, and we've got about 60,000 comparisons, thanks to part of the team. In fact, you can see one of the team who I've beheaded, which is Maddie. I actually do have a picture of Maddie there, and if she's in the room. So if you want to hear about any of these issues of coordinating 134 local volunteers on WhatsApp over a very small period, please do talk to Maddie, because she created this, and Bertrand created the interface. So that was the grid. So I'm going to spin through this really quickly. And from that, you can create a ground truth for vulnerability in areas. And then we can use that as our cursory first data set. So then the idea is that's not enough. So we take this to the next stage where we're doing physical surveys to get those data points. And we had 163 volunteers that are going around. They're about halfway through at the moment of the city. And we're going to end up from the survey with about 150,000 data points that we then hope we can feed in to the AI community to start looking at the covariates that we've got, the big data streams, the satellite imagery, the mobile phones, the census information, to see if we can use that to build a model of the ground truths that we're building. So we ask questions, 3 questions along the way, 3 that come up which are related: high rates of children not in education, such as child labour, early marriages, sex trafficking, and so on. I'm going to skip very quickly. Please do come and see me after about these. And the questions are giving us, and they're very tricky questions to ask. So we worked very much from GSI indicators and so on. Okay, skipping very quickly through this to get these first data points through. And we also took photos, so we created our own ImageNet as well that we can then let people see. So in summary, skipping all these completely, if you do want to see these, come and see me after. We can get these covariates from mobile phone data streams and drone imagery to try and find the links between what we can see of those data sets and the final survey results, so we can then create a model we can use in other cities, and we don't have to do the expensive surveys again. So yeah, way too many slides. Let's just go for this last one. The punchline is the end, really. With a combination of behavioral data, drone imagery, and ground truthing, we're hoping the AI community can come together and start creating new models based on this. Okay, sorry, I've gone over time there.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you, James. That was a lot of information. Very good. No, it was excellent. So I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Does anyone want to start? So one of the questions I do have
Thank God you had a question.
Yes, I know. Well, I think we're just warming everyone up. They're absorbing. But so this is really opening up a whole new potential of how we're engaging with data on the ground, right? So one of the challenges we have with surveys, of course, is that a lot of the representative household surveys are traditionally done in Western settings. So it's very fascinating that you're finding all of these ways to make this more applicable to the local context. And your findings are amazing. The early marriages, that has huge potential for the forced marriage calculations that we're all trying to do globally. So I think it's a really great case study of how we can try to replicate these findings. Is there anything else that you found compelling about that process?
Well, I mean, we're asking very specific questions. So there's a lot of questions on the survey, and we have, ethical issues when you send people out into the communities to ask these questions, and so they're very carefully put. But we are physically asking questions about forced marriage, the age people are getting married, but also whether people are being forced into labour that is not their choice. So those questions are there, and we didn't expect people to be answering them necessarily, but they are answering them, and we are seeing signal in the data. So we're very optimistic about the moment this will be a good base data set for us to build on.
Yes, thank you. Christy, I think you have a question.
I guess, and almost just an introduction, I already let you know that I do want to follow up. I'm Christy Weigel with United Against Slavery, and one of the things, as Davina knows, we've been working on for 4.5 years, and we're about to launch the National Outreach Survey, which is frontline data from 29 stakeholders across the globe. We feel in order to combat human trafficking, we've got to find out what is and isn't working from those on the front lines, and I'm thrilled to say that we have one of the stakeholder groups is early and forced marriages, former fosters for those working in the orphanage. But we are thoroughly excited to be here, first and foremost. But within the survey that we're going to be having, there'll be close to 1,000 survey questions where each stakeholder group will be asked a smaller number of questions. And again, to find out what is and isn't working, to find out where there are gaps in services, to find out where there are, as you all know, the anti-trafficking movement has become quite divisive. And so we're going there on a lot of issues. And within the data that we're going to be collecting, I can tell you, I've been taking just numerous notes here. Most of those that are here are going to be able to utilize part of that data. And at the conclusion of the National Outreach Survey, we will be launching an online open source database to where researchers can disseminate that data on a further scale. But we have partnered and collaborated with over 50 subject matter experts from across the globe in those 29 stakeholder groups. And we have been not only survivor informed, but we have both sex and labor trafficking survivors that have been a part of this process, both on an academic level, but also in reviewing everything that we're doing. So I do hope to connect with you later, but I guess I don't have a question, just really just saying, hey.
Well, actually, one of the things I think that maybe you could comment on based on that is that I think a lot of us do have surveys that we're trying to put out into the field. And I think in the process of survey design and this cognitive testing that we undergo to try to understand, I mean, this is something that spoke to me from your presentation, is that the cognitive testing alone to get a survey that was this responsive with this population must have been challenging.
Yes, and I probably spent too much time on that because it's not actually my area of expertise. We've leveraged like the intelligence of a lot of other people when it comes to this, and still made mistakes. So we've had lots of issues. We're not physically there, so we have to rely on a team that we've got in country. There is the surveyors who will not. Essentially, there will be fraud on the survey, so you have to do a huge process of trying to check the results of you go, and that's just a fact of life when you do these things. But yeah, I think we're going in a direction. If we can work with other people who are doing this sort of thing, fantastic.
Looks like we have a few questions in the back.
Actually, my first one is a comment to Emily and the organizer. Is it possible to have a list of participants? For example, the lady there made a really useful comment, but I couldn't write down everything and I haven't got her name.
Oh, sure.
just about what everyone else is doing and like what sort of data
Oh,
they're
sure.
collecting. That was really,
And that
really
was
helpful.
Christy Wiggle from
Yes,
the.
yes.
But we also have a rapporteur who will be providing.
I think it'd be
a
really
readout
nice
of
to
the
have all these lists and then the slides. And then the other questions for the presenters is, do you have any such work in the UK? And also, how do you interact with the NGOs or maybe the government agency? How have actually this work, I would imagine this work must have gone back into the real practice, into law enforcement. I would like to hear more about that.
So it's very early in the process. So we work with NGOs in the local area. One, Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, who've done lots of work, not specifically on 8.7, but on flooding in areas. And so they have a network and government connections that we've leveraged. We work with the World Bank as well, who are keen to help in this area, and we found very useful. And also been supported by NGOs and local universities. So it really is a community of different groups working together on this at the moment. There is a lot of local government, so we've paused at the moment to speak to the next round of ward officers. So when you do, as you do it, we're speaking to the individual local, essentially council members for each of those small areas, of which there are lots. So it's quite time intensive, but really is as kind of a consortium of different stakeholders working together at the moment, which takes time and is tricky, but is worth doing.
And just on one more note on that too, if you're asking about actionable outcomes from some of these surveys, one of the things that we found for the global estimates was that withheld wages was a huge reason why a lot of people were staying in situations of forced labor. So that did present a bit of a different alternative to how we were looking at policy interventions in terms of workers' rights. Yes, please. I think we have time for one more question in the back.
Hi there, my name's Steve from the British Army. I'm just wondering, how far away do you think we are from having a training data set for AI, and what do you think needs to be done in order to have that available for this community to develop the technologies that we're looking at?
Yeah, well, we're hoping in a couple of months is our aim. Maybe that's a bit optimistic. I think we're Maddie, the end of March. We're hoping we can bring this together. And now we're very keen on the policy of open processes, both with our code and our work and the data sets. There are a few issues with the covariates, the drone imagery that we have attached to it, the mobile phone information that we need to aggregate in some way so people can make an attempt to build the models from it. But yeah, in a few months' time, we think we'll have the start of something, and then we'll aim to publish and release it at the same time through the Rights Lab. So.
And thank you for that question. Actually, that's a perfect segue to our final presenter, Harry, who is curating one of the most impressive collaborations on data sharing in this space at the moment.
You're too kind. Thank you, Davina. I've got the benefit of having had the introductory session, of course, so I don't need to go too much over. Here we go. Too much over the concept again. I won't spend too much time on the process of creating the site either, because actually it's something that we'll talk a little bit more about tomorrow, because we did a lot of work on standardization, setting data standards, harmonizing our data sets, and working out what the best anonymization protocols would be. But it'll just be enough to give you a bit of an idea of what the data is that we have and how we can actually use it, because that's what I want to focus on a bit more. So there's a couple of things that I'd like to show you on the site to give you a bit more of a flavor of the types of data we want to put out. Then I'd like to sort of try to open a bit more about the brainstorming the kinds of applications and uses that these data could actually have. If we do get on that far, then maybe there'll be some ethical issues raised as well. So just to take you back quickly, so this is the sort of problem set that we were trying to solve. We're starting with the case data that 3 agencies have, but the idea is that it's actually scalable to any agency that collects case data. All they have to do is to map to the standard, and then we'll combine and put it through, which is already de-identified before they actually send it to us. And then we will de-identify it a second time using k-anonymization. Which, for those of you that don't know, for us that's basically setting k to 11. So you can't query the database and return fewer than 10 cases, no matter how detailed your query is, basically. So that's how we were trying to get over the problem that someone might actually have some other piece of data that they are able to combine with the data that's published, and they will be able to use that to identify a person. So, for example, if you were the trafficker and someone escaped, you know, maybe it was someone that spoke, someone from a small island who spoke a rare language or who worked on a specific type of farm in a specific state, you would be able to see that case pop up in the data set, and you would then know that that person had actually collaborated at least with us, or you know, with an assistance actor, maybe also with law enforcement. So obviously there's quite kind of, you know, serious repercussions that we're trying to avoid there. So that's that. So we went through the process of kind of creating this harmonized data set, first with Polaris and then with Liberty Shared is their new name. And out of that, we ended up with this total, as I mentioned before. So the idea is really that now we can just add more and more contributors and enlarge this data set. Now, obviously, what I would like to talk about as well is sort of what Todd mentioned last time, how best can we use and interpret these data when they're coming from direct assistance. You know, obviously that's not a random sample, but at the same time, when you have, say, 90,000 records, if prevalence is thought to be about 4 in 1,000, that's the same as talking to every victim of trafficking in the state of New York, for example, or in a country like the Netherlands. So it's it is big, but it's also, I think, the detail that that it affords that you wouldn't be able to find normally either. So very detailed information on each individual that you wouldn't usually be able to get through a prevalence survey, for example. So I think the idea is really like how can these data be used to complement different types of work, which I'll get onto later. So there's two main outputs. One is the k-anonymized disaggregated data that is available for download, something I wasn't able to get to in the last session. But if you go to the site, there's a download page. It is heavily anonymized at the moment. We'd welcome ideas of how we can do better to release more. And there you'll also find the data dictionary and the code book to explain what we've done, and of course explain what the format is of the data and so on. The rest of I mean, before the k-anonymization process, we also use the full data set to feed into all the visual content on the site. So all of the interactive visualizations. So that's a way of trying to present more information to a public audience without just relying on this heavily de-identified version of the data set. So if we can go to the site now, please, Emily. Thank you. Might be having a few issues there. Okay. I had wanted to show you something we haven't published just yet, but unfortunately it's a bit fiddly relying on Emily, so I'm just going to show you this one. Well, we had sort of had a regression model previously, but this is still pretty new. We released it a few months ago. So if you can, stop at the pie chart at the top. So this is based on individual route segments that victims undertake, so where they're trafficked through, about 10,000 different route segments. And this is the first time we've sort of published analysis in this way on that data set. So what we can see here basically is that the proportion of victims who are trafficked through official border points, checkpoints, is actually 80% when it comes to the cases that we assist, which is quite high compared to what some people might think. If we can go down slightly. There are differences in demographics of the types of victims that tend to be more commonly trafficked through unofficial border crossing points, or border crossing points without official checkpoints, let's say. And that is mostly because if you can scroll down, the differences are really about the type of exploitation. So it's much more prevalent or much more likely for cases of trafficking for sexual exploitation, you can see here as well. And we can also see if people have been exploited on the route or not. And if we can scroll down a bit more, we also see that the duration of trafficking is longer for those who have been trafficked through official border points. And that's probably partly to do with the profile of kind of trafficking for labor exploitation and the different types of control that perpetrators use to control their victims. If we can scroll down a little bit as well, just a bit further, please. Sorry. So here we've also got data on the fact that quite a lot of people are still traveling through on forged documents. So 10% actually of those traffic through official border points are traveling on forged documents. And then if we can go down a bit more, and also a large segment who are not traveling using their own documents at all, potentially also with someone else's. Also quite significant differences, obviously, as you'd expect in the modes of transportation. There's quite a large air segment here for those traffic through official border points, as you'd expect. But it's really, the majority is really through bus and train terminals, which suggests a different, maybe a different emphasis also. But the other good thing about, the fact that we have data on air travel is that we also have data with the airport codes. So we're also working with IATA, the International Airline Transport Association, to look at how we can actually use that as a basis to start trying to inform prevention efforts, for example, train airline staff to do identification, sensitize airport staff, and even have those kind of sensitization campaigns at airports as well. So if we can go, sorry, just up to the top. So let's give you a bit of a, go back to the presentation, actually, sorry, since we have so little time. Let's just give you a bit of an idea about the types of data we have. We will be trying to display that kind of on a map as well, so you can see A to B to C to D, etc. But I think what I'd be looking for your input on as well is, now that this sort of data is becoming available for the first time, how can it be best used? And we have a few different ideas on there for that. First of all, of course, it can feed into these types of initiatives on mapping and modeling vulnerability that we've seen today. It's, obviously that's one data set that can feed into those types of exercises. Using imputation, or at least trying to use data that's, let's say, broader and more representative of the whole population. For example, those collected by national reporting mechanisms and national rapporteurs where they exist. Sometimes you will have broader coverage, but it won't be disaggregate data and it won't have the detail. So how can we basically use that detail to complement those types of data sets? Complementing survey data and administrative data. We've used the data to, for example, correct for the surveys for the global list and modern slavery, because they weren't able to survey, they weren't able to ask questions in household surveys about sexual exploitation, or capture a lot of data about children, because that was severely underreported. So all of these types of applications, I think also what we're looking to do now is see if we can use, with the private sector, use the data to map risks in global supply chains as well. Looking at different tiers of production, if we're able to assign values to those production tiers, then that's one way of trying to do that. Also looking at the global labor supply element of that, we have data on recruitment fees and abuse during the recruitment process. Again, if we're able to get that into a format where the private sector can use that to model the risk and map risk in their supply chains, then hopefully that'll be another good outcome to this type of work as well. So I'll stop there because I have already gone over slightly.
Okay, thank you.
But thank you.
Thank you, Harry. That was a lovely presentation. All right, and with that, we officially have 21 minutes for our remaining questions and answers. And remember, this is interactive, so feel free to put up a 2-finger if you have a comment or a question that builds on the preceding comment or question, so that we're not necessarily jumping around to completely unrelated topics. So who would like to start us off? Yes, please.
Thank you to all of the presenters for this session. I guess this is a bit of a reflection and question not only to the panelists here, but to the participants, the audience here, is I think a common theme that we've heard throughout the morning is not only sort of the capturing of data through surveys, but other methods. And also, I guess I should say, even with these surveys we've heard, there are surveys that have been developed to try and capture child labor, but ones for drug trafficking, et cetera, and other ones, which we are now trying to explore how we might be able to harness all of that, right, and bring that together, whether that's for vulnerability mapping, other estimates of prevalence and risk. So question to the panelists and to the community here is, what do we see as some of those challenges, the computational challenges in doing that, managing or measuring the uncertainty, challenges with, as we try to combine sources, are we capturing individuals in duplication or triplication because of this, which may or may not matter from potentially an aggregate perspective, but we need to consider that. So just putting it out there is sort of, what are we thinking about as those challenges?
Hello, my name is Claudia Jüch. I'm the CEO of the Cloudera Foundation, which is a new foundation that works on using data analytics and machine learning to have positive impact on people's lives. I unfortunately don't have the answer to your question. Instead, I wanted to build on your question. Clearly, we all know that the data is imperfect for a variety of reasons that I think the panelists have very well illustrated. But what can we do to verify the data, given that we are looking at kind of hidden information in any way? So how are we looking forward and to understand where the data hits the mark and where there are kind of more significant gaps, and so what's that plausibility testing, and how can we improve on that then going forward?
We'll keep this one in the first couple of rows.
Hi, my name is Shiba. I'm from BSR. I had a quick question for Harry on this last presentation. I was curious to know if there has been any research done on particular industries where human trafficking is more prevalent, if you have any data related to some of the statistics or some of the information you've already provided related to routes and things like that. If you can talk about any industry-specific data you have, that would be great. Thanks.
Well, yes, we do. We're actually trying to move the whole data model closer to the ISIC, the International Standard Industry Classification, and try to capture as much as we can at the lower level of disaggregation, so that like the 2 digits on the ISIC, for example. However, historically, that's not really how data have been collected by us or by other people who are providing assistance. It's at a higher level of aggregation. So we're talking about data on construction, hospitality, for example, domestic work, but less on finer grained levels on kind of like what type of manufacturing, for example. So I think that's something where we would like to have more granularity. For sure. The data are available that we have so far. We've published, I think, about 6 data stories on different industries on the website, so you can take a look at that. I mean, in some cases, it's the usual suspects, obviously. I mean, the other reason that data haven't been collected in that format previously is because there's a range of different types of exploitation that don't really fall neatly into that either. I'm talking about things like begging, for example, which is not considered an economic branch of economic activity, but is a form of forced labor. So there are those sorts of considerations as well. But I think absolutely that's really key, and it's only by doing that we'll actually be able to use it to plug into other types of models.
And I'd also add there's a little bit of information on that in the global estimates of modern slavery, where they look at kind of like the global level, but again, it's not quite that detailed. And to my knowledge, I know the Responsible Sourcing Network and the Cotton Campaign has been doing some really interesting things from the ground level up. So what I would imagine is maybe what you would look, it depends on kind of what your interest area is, if it's like regional or if it has to do with specific industries. And then I might even just recommend drilling down into some of the groups that have been more advocates and trying to come up with local level measurements. So the Cotton Campaign is going to come out with a measurement study that they've done in, I think, a couple months, where they've come up with an innovative approach to try to understand compulsory versus involuntary and voluntary cotton picking in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Okay. Yes, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. My name is Felipe Arosvera. I'm assistant professor of industrial engineering at Ohio University. I was wondering about the time evolution of the data. My impression is that it might be naive to think that having a picture of the situation will allow us to fight it and end the problem of human trafficking. And I'm wondering, do we have timestamps of either industries, or regions, or vulnerabilities? And are we thinking towards the future in terms of what kind of patterns and like networks or any kind of organization underlying this human trafficking industry, so we can identify these patterns to fight human trafficking?
So I'm not sure I can comment on human trafficking in general, but I can maybe touch on the issues you talked about with the temporal nature of the data sets and how tricky they are. So I think that's a key thing. The problem with surveying in general, I say this a lot on grants, is it's really expensive and it's out of date by the time you finished it. And hence our sort of passion for proxies, so behavioral data sets and imagery data sets, things that can be refreshed in more of a timely way. And you know they're not exactly like the ground truth, but if you can build a machine learning model or a statistical model that makes that connection, you're then not in the dark. You've got something you will need to refresh in the future, but then you can, from that model that you created, at least get some insight from these other data sets, which aren't surveying, which aren't census, but are more behavioral and are there. Companies are full of data that they're using for profit that can be used for social good. And so I'm very passionate about companies do want to work with people like this community to help out, and we just have to go and seek them out and make those connections. The other, I had one more comment. The other aspect is, well, for traditional machine learning, it's kind of assumed that data is nicely, neatly, temporally aligned. It kind of comes from scientific data where someone's just got a nice time series of events. And we don't have that, so we need more research and techniques. Things like, there's a new field in mathematics called object-oriented data analysis, or topological data space, which tries to align things and comment statistically on how things are changing. And I think we need to look in those areas.
Wonderful, thank you. Any comments?
Yeah, maybe just to add on the temporal aspect, that's I think something that everyone's struggling with a lot. I mean, for us, for example, it's, you know, we have a machine timestamp of you know, when a case was registered in our database, but when they actually, you know, left the trafficking situation, or when they actually were first identified, or maybe the caseworker didn't get around to entering the information until, you know, like a couple of months later or something. You know, there's all kinds of issues there. But then also when we start to what we realized when we started to put it into this sort of format is actually an issue for the identification as well, and it's something where, you know, we could add data to this site on a daily basis, but actually that's compromising potentially for de-identification. We've also so far had to be really, really high in aggregation for what we have presented so far for the same reason as well. So everything is by year. If that at the moment. So yeah, very tricky. Just in terms of specific industries, I mean, I think we kind of need to look at a different model to report that information. But I think sort of a survivor-centered approaches where people can actually be empowered to refer that information themselves is probably a better way of doing that. So having sort of, you know, portals where people can report things, for example, and for organizations to be able to refer more easily along those levels might be one way of doing that. We've seen, for example, when people transiting across countries in the Mediterranean, They don't want to stop moving in any case. Who do they report it to? How do they report this to Interpol, for example, or Europol? Well, right now they have no mechanism, but if you had mechanisms where they could actually do that, maybe that's one way to, have more timely information reported.
No, related to the patterns, for example, for the case of child labor in specific in our countries in Latin America, is a little different because we probably have a lot of information about child labor and patterns related to family, economic situation of the family, a rural situation, a productive sector. But our principal main problem now is how we do for our governments in the different locals, government or other stakeholders, use this data in order to make decisions. And the best decision to break child labor trajectory, because we know what happened. But for example, with this model of Rick's model, we offer a previous information that the pattern is this, and you can act it before that the child labor appear in this family or appear in this community. No, but we need to connect every day. We need to improve the connection between our generation of knowledge and information and machine learning and all this kind of data with our politicians and our private stakeholders in order to their decision reflect a change and towards and help us towards to 8.7 target, for example. This is the situation in Latin America.
This has been a really interesting commentary, I think, on how we avoid some of the administrative data lag that we're all suffering from in our modeling. So that also has a huge impact on our vulnerability work. So even for the Global Slavery Index, when we've looked at countries that we know to be in situations of ongoing conflict, Venezuela, for example, the administrative data lag can be almost 2 to 3 years before that data starts to be reflected in some of these more empirical models. So I think this idea of ground truthing mechanisms, looking at multiple data sources, and then trying to understand the shortcomings in like the data, specifically if it's time-stamped or obtained at point of collection versus point of origin. So it'll be kind of interesting. Any other comments, questions? Let's see. Yes, please, of course, yeah. About 8 minutes, you guys, so
right,
don't sit on those questions too long.
Actually, back to Harry, I guess. How do you envision, you mentioned the application of these data methodologies to global supply chains. That's a very dynamic, I guess, set of industries. So what kind of data, how do you think the temporal evolution will influence your results, or what is what do you envision in terms of identifying how global supply chains are playing a role in modern day slavery?
Difficult question. Well, I think, at least we can start to try to build some models with the data we have, I think. I mean, it's not going to be very, targeted. Let's say it's going to be, macro models first and foremost, right? Or at least using more macro data to feed into, more micro work that industries undertake. But right now I think they don't have any basis upon really, upon which to do that. But at least if we're able to, add some kind of weights to particular segments, and then they're actually able to map back their tiers, then they can at least apply those sorts of weights, depending on the prevalence or depending on the risk of or the likelihood that victims are identified in that sector. At least those kinds of initial models, I think, using the different data sets that we have available with the different organizations would be useful. And then obviously you need to see if it's for the internal market or for the external markets, and there are differences there, and we don't always have differences in prevalence for those as well.
That's a great question. And actually, one of the things that we've started looking at is trade data. So looking at imports and exports as they've been coming throughout the G20 countries. So one of the things that we did find in a regional analysis for the Asia-Pacific region, looking at just imports and exports of G20 countries from high-risk, known products that are at high risk, that are, these are things that are tracked in the U.S. There's like interdiction orders as they come into the borders. And there's some information on that. Of course, as I was thinking about the question of timing, though, that's still like an annual count. Typically, there's not really a way to get quarterly updates on that unless you were somehow manually calculating it through like the trade databases. So I think what you could do is maybe start looking at kind of what Harry was saying, the existing data sources. A lot of that would be a lot of trade data at this point. And we do have other information we can triangulate with that from the Department of Labor's lists of forced goods made from forced and child labor, and then some of the Department of Homeland Security in the U.S. also has orders to prevent importation of goods that are made with forced labor from North Korea, for example. So you have some basis for that, but I think, I'm not sure that I've seen a systematic model yet, but that data does exist. So of course, the AI folks in the room can create one. Any comments, James? Anything? Any?
Just one comment. So my undergrad was in economics, so a lot of aggregate figures and people squashing models onto them and not generalizing. And I think it's really useful to think about finer grained data where it's possible. And I only say because we're lucky to our access in East Africa to mobile money data. And 25% of GDP goes through mobile money in Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania at the moment. So there's rich real-time data sources there which are available to us. We haven't looked at them yet, but you can see financial flows and patterns in there which could feed into all of this.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. We have about time to probably take both of them, so let's start with.
I just had a quick question about, so you keep mentioning like things like data proxies, like using some of the mobile mini data. Through our research, we use a lot of data proxies to sort of try and find indicators and more fine-grained data, but one of the issues we run into a lot is how to separate out, let's say, like benign transactions versus those that would be indicative of trafficking. I don't know if you've sort of worked in that space or have any comments about that.
So I didn't quite hear you properly. So
I'm sorry, does it work? No. Oh, much closer. Okay. Oh, that's how it works. So you guys have been mentioning a lot about using proxy data, like the mobile mini data and a few others. And so we do a lot of that in my own research, but one of the problems we run into a lot is trying to weed out things that are related to trafficking versus just sort of benign data, like just maybe a regular money transaction or some other stuff. I didn't know if you had any commentary about how to sort of deal with that or what we should be looking into.
Well, I mean, I don't have any answers for you because we haven't specifically looked at that in our research, but I've talked to lots of credit card companies and it seems like there's a body of work on, credit card fraud, for example, looking for instances of truth, your true positives. And we need those, I think. It's very hard without that. So, to start with, you've got to bootstrap it qualitatively. I think in terms of machine learning, lots of semi-supervised approaches where you get results and you iterate your algorithm. So it gives you things of higher probability and you investigate them further to see whether you as a human believe that's a truth. And this is actually, if you go to the next session about brick kiln identification, that was a process that was undertaken there. It's a very similar thing. The brick kilns look very similar to roundabouts. So you get a dual brick kiln roundabout detector and you have to, get a human to look at some of those examples that come out and try and iterate and refeed the algorithm. So it's a very tricky, challenging problem. But I think, an iterative human in the loop approach is the only way of doing it.
And then Chloe, I think you are our last question.
Hi, Chloe from Limos again. I wanted to ask a question about semantics and definitions, really. And I wanted to know how much or whether this comes up as a challenge in the work that you're doing of how we have precise definitions of some of the things that we're talking about. Because obviously there's often cultural interpretations like, what is a child, how old is a child, what is child labour, and then also with modern slavery as a sort of catch-all term that gets used quite a lot, but isn't necessarily legally defined, and then trafficking and how that fits within, and servitude and forced labour and compulsory labour, and how they all fit within that broader umbrella of modern slavery as we use as a sort of catch-all term. But I mean, from a country level, I think I'm just thinking from a UK perspective, working on the modern slavery legislation there, we saw like the definition, the legal definition in the criminal law requires movement to be present, for example, in its definition of modern slavery in trafficking, in its definition of trafficking in the English and Welsh legislation. But in Scotland, for example, it isn't required. And it's interesting just to sort of look at it from when we're doing surveys like this, how important is it for us to have very precise definitions and the careful use of semantics.
Thank you, Chloe. So I'll let Harry also speak about a bit of the synchronization process as they were trying to match victim data between the Polaris data set and the IOM data set. But just as a quick note on that from our perspective, working under the Palermo Protocol guidance, right, is significantly broader than almost any national mandate. So that's something we also encounter in the U.S. with the Trafficking Victim Protection Act standard, which doesn't have a clear avenue for forced marriage, which of course we've counted. So I think the challenge becomes: are we looking at a more universal, like a broader definition that will capture more forms of modern slavery, and then how can we enable national stakeholders to then operationalize those considerations, and how do you manage those expectations with what's legally codified? And also then how do you maybe use that as a way to advocate for the legalization of more forms, against more forms of modern slavery? But then I'll let Harry take it from here.
Yeah, we're talking a little bit about this in a session tomorrow, but sorry, masking tape on the floor. Yeah, it's essential, I think, to try to have those kinds of definitions in place, which most organizations try to do for their caseworkers. But for caseworkers, it's like a usability issue. You know, it's like a user interface issue. We have caseworkers in 150 different countries, potentially, at least 115 at the moment. And you know, prostitution is legal in some countries, not in others. You know, there's very different social, cultural issues there. I mean, obviously you can fix some of these issues at the back end when it comes to reporting and pulling different fields and putting them together. But if the person, you know, doesn't understand this specific means of control is supposed to be about this group of people or that group of people, if we don't have those kinds of definitions written up, then obviously what you get at the end is just kind of soup. You know, it's quite hard to interpret. Although we've been pretty lucky so far with the organizations we've been working with, because they have had those definitions in place. The other thing I would just say is that when it came to merging different data sets, I mean, we had different organizations using different legal instruments, but we were kind of at a deeper level of granularity than that anyway, and the type of data that we were collecting was basically the same, whether or not it was to fit the Palermo Protocol definition or the US legal definition, for example. But I can imagine that will be coming up as we increase the contributors moving forward.
Final comments from the panel. We're about anything?
Well, just one comment about contextualization. It's a really important issue. We work really heavily with local communities, so they have to be engaged, and they translate all our questions for us. So we need them to put it in the context of, you know, what modern slavery means in those areas. I think we need to be really wary about getting hung up on definitions, because modern slavery covers too many things. We all really know there's lots of separate issues inside there. I've even, you know, I've heard people talk about the fact that modern slavery doesn't exist, and it's a Western post-colonial invention. But you know, when you go to places and you see girls who are cut and then forced into forced marriage, it becomes less of an important question, and I think that can bind us down. So I think we should think about that. It's very important. Curate the data, think how it's created, so people can see what it comes from and what it means. But I don't think we should get tied down too much with it to stop us actually going and doing the work.
Thank you, James. And anything, Maria, would you like to add?
Only related to the last comment, for example, and in between our agencies and the United Nations agencies, we have a big challenge to improve our coordination, our alliance, respect to the definition. Because, for example, one country ratified a protocol or a convention, and probably the definition has something different aspect where the country has to apply this convention at the national legislation. And we have continue to improve our alignment between our agencies at the economic clerk and the OEM and UNICEF and ILO. It's true that we support better our countries. It's necessary to align better our national instruments of legislation, international instruments.
Thank you. And then Chloe, I'm happy to chat about this later, but the US is currently doing something with the human trafficking analytical model through the Homeland Security's Fusion Center. And we're actually facing the same issue on a state-by-state jurisdictional challenge in terms of how, so I'm happy to talk to you after about how that works. But guys, I'm really sorry. I've kept you 5 minutes from lunch, but I think we've had a wonderful presentation. So please join me in thanking our presenters. All right, time to eat.